right, so we're focusing on the musculoskeletal system, and we're going to be spending some time working with both stretching today and resistance work on Tuesday and Thursday next week. Some down in the little fitness center, some over in Brooks Gym, some in the swimming pool. So let's go ahead and talk about the musculoskeletal system. Okay, it's broken down into three basic parts. You've got the bones, or the skeleton. You've got the joint structures, and you've got the actual muscles themselves. Now remember, you folks are going to be receiving these PowerPoints, so if you want to highlight things along the way, but want to go ahead and try to keep things moving. Let's focus specifically on the skeletal bones. A normal human body has 206 bones. Now, you would have less than that if we have maybe an amputation or a congenital abnormality, and the same thing if you were to have more. When I was an undergraduate at Westchester, one of the big star athletes that people follow was Julius Erving, who had extremely large hands. The rumor mill used to be that he actually had an extra digit. The reality is he just had really long bones. Now there are two athletes that I've heard of a little bit more recently that you're familiar with. LeBron James supposedly on one foot has 6 toes, which happens in probably 1 out of 100,000 people. But another one that actually affects performance, professional golfer Natalie Gulbis supposedly has an extra vertebra. And the extra vertebra supposedly has to do with the extreme flexion that she has in her swing. But a normal human body, you'd have 206 bones. All right, what are the functions of the skeleton? For starters, whether you have an exoskeleton like an insect or a crustacean, or an interior skeleton like the 5 classes of vertebrates, this is where you have your structure, your form. If you don't have a, quote, skeleton, you'd be like a jellyfish. Whatever way the wind or the water goes, that's the form that you would take. Now, there was a disease that was supposedly caused by mercury poisoning that led to a dissolving of the bones that occurred back, I believe, in Minamata Bay in Japan back in the late 60s, early 70s. The American nickname for it was something like ouch ouch, but it had a more scientific name. What would happen to a human being if he or she was completely without bones? Well, here's a good little demonstration right here from an episode of Family Guy. And here's what happens.
Yeah, well, I'm sick of hearing it. I'm sorry, buddy. I can't turn it off. Well, then, I'm going to break every bone in your body. I wish I had no bones. Don't. Yeah, I'll show you.
All right. So again, when you figure that the human body is predominantly water, if we took away the bones, you'd have that basic blob look to you. All right. Protection. Think about the ribs and all the different internal organs that are contained inside of the ribs. And what would happen if the ribs were actually removed, how vulnerable you'd be. That's why if you're driving in an older vehicle that doesn't have airbags, if you were to be in a front-on collision and you go into that steering column, one of the first things that happens is that xiphoid process breaks off the sternum, ruptures the spleen. And if you didn't have ribs, you'd be in a world of hurt in terms of it basically liquefying all of your internal organs. Blood production and movement. Let's talk about the joint structures. All right, ligaments. When you talk about all of the different bones, what puts the skeleton together? Those are ligaments. Some of you might have ever played the little children's game called Operation. How many of you have ever seen that, where you take little tweezers, you try to remove the bones? Well, if I were to take all those bones and I wanted to go ahead and assemble a skeleton, now we're taking little pieces of tape to attach. Those little pieces of tape equivalent in the body would be ligaments. Now, ligaments, they stabilize the joints and they can be stretched a little bit. Tendons are what would be the equivalent of, let's say we had a marionette. Now think about what a marionette is. That's the string puppets. And by themselves, the bones aren't going to do anything. So something has to go ahead and grasp on to move them. The tendons, which attach to the bones, and they attach the muscles to the bones, when a muscle contracts, that moves the bones and thus facilitates movement. Okay, like the ligaments, They're slightly flexible, and therefore are able to make movement. And if we are able to stretch capacity of the movement of the tendons, we increase the range of motion. Now, this is something I want you to be able to distinguish the difference between tissue and fibers. A lot of folks make this mistake on my exams, especially the big one at the end of the year, the optional final. Muscle tissue is different in different parts of the body, and the reason I bring that up is since you were little kids, you were probably educated that the heart is the most important muscle in the body. And yes, it is a muscle. It does contract and it does elongate just like the muscles of the biceps, triceps, etc. But they don't have necessarily the same structure. Cardiac muscle looks a little bit like this. And some of the different muscles have a different number of nuclei in the different fibers. Cardiac muscle is involuntary. It's not something you control on demand. All right? And it's only found in the heart. Smooth muscle also is involuntary, but this is what we find in the blood vessels, in the internal organs, and the eye. Involuntary might be a little thing you might want to put a little asterisk next to, because that might appear, hint, hint, on an exam question. Again, you don't have voluntary control over the pancreas, the spleen, etc. Alrighty, now you may have certain things that you have a little bit more voluntary control over, but by and large, the muscles that are considered smooth in nature are involuntary. What we focus on in this class are the quote skeletal or movement muscles. Okay, now let's talk about all these different muscles and how they are named. For starters, you have some, the direction that they go, oblique, acute, etc. Then you have muscles where they're basically named by their size. Now, when mom or dad or a PE teacher said, move your gluteus maximus right now, we all knew that meant move the fanny, but there's a maximus in there. That's not saying you got a big butt. That's saying that there's actually multiple muscles in the gluteal area, the maximus being the biggest. That means somewhere along the line there's probably also a medius, a minimus, etc. And if you have muscles where one out of a collection is longer than the other, then you might have a quote longus or brevis muscle. All right, location. All right, if you know the names of different bones, sometimes you can figure out, without necessarily knowing, where the location of a muscle is relative to bones. All right, we use right here, for instance. Go ahead and sit up straight if you would, please. Everyone reach around and touch your own scapula. Okay, the shoulder blades. You've got two of them in the back. All righty? Now, I'm going to assume he doesn't know where the, quote, subscapularis is, but if I were to give that term, sub and scapularis, point on the person in front of you with your pen, where do you think his subscapularis would be? Pardon? Below. Good. Below, as long as he knows where the scapula is, it's right below where the scapula is. So that's where the subscapularis would be found. So if we have things like sub, supra, infra, medial, lateral, those are all examples of muscles that get their name through their location. Alrighty, the number of origins. I think one of the persons went through the whole gamut there. Quadra, tri, biceps. That's simply the number of heads or crowns of the muscle. So whenever you hear something that has names bi, tri, etc., that's just simply the number of heads or crowns of that particular muscle. The origin and insertion. The brachioradialis is basically a combination of a muscle that's attached to both the radius and the humerus. So somewhere we know that between here, where the radius is, and the humerus, that's where that particular muscle is going to be located. Alrighty, and the shape. And if I could show a good sample of a muscle as a very, very pronounced shape, the deltoid's probably one of the best. This is what a deltoid muscle looks like in the body. Everyone point to your deltoid muscle. If you were to actually take a look at this muscle, it has the look of a delta or an upside down triangle. So this is one that has a fairly pronounced shape. Any of the muscles that have the names that are similar to shapes that you remember from your 9th or 10th grade geometry or trigonometry class, those are muscles that are shape named. Give me some examples of muscles that take on the names of geometric shapes. I heard someone mention one earlier. People that have that V-shaped swim build. Okay, what shape is that? Begins with a TR. A trapezoid. The trapezius that gives people, you see this a lot again in swimmers, that are built really big along the sides and then the back tends to narrow down. Okay, those would be the trapezius muscles that's shaped like a trapezoid. Okay, in the upper back, we have a muscle that is shaped like a rhombus. What are those called? Rhomboids. Okay, rhomboid muscles. So the muscles that have very pronounced geometric shapes, those are your, quote, shape muscles. And probably the ones that have one of the most obvious are the muscles that are named by what they do. Now, I'm going to have you guys sit. We'll be getting to a chance to go and move around when we go downstairs to work on flexibility. Using nothing more than your arms. Just go ahead and drop your pen and put your arms out of your hands. I want you to demonstrate the following things. Show me basic flexion and extension. Okay, good. If you were pretending to do a biceps curl, alrighty, this would be the flexion, this would be the extension. I had someone in the last class actually do the hand and wrist. Okay, also effective. Alrighty, show me abduction, adduction. Okay, pretty close, good. Alrighty, whether it's this or this. If we're doing abduction, AB, if we're abducting it, we're taking it away from the middle of the body. If we're adding it or adducting it, we're bringing it back to the middle. Now, probably the one that's the trickiest, but I'll bet someone will get this. Who can show me pronation or supination? You're pretty close right there, Anthony. Alrighty. If we are in the prone position, we're lying down in our belly. So everyone, put your hands out in the prone position, and if we want to supinate them, okay, we'd be in the equivalent of the supine position. So pronation and supination. All right. A lot of folks are more familiar with pronation and supination through the movement of the ankle or the heel in terms of your running gait. Those that are runners, sometimes you can tell the foot pattern where it wears on the tread as to whether or not they're, quote, over-pronators or over-supinators. And you can get orthotics specifically designed to your running gait depending on how it is that you land on your foot. All right, let's go ahead back. So again, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, pronation, supination are all examples of muscles that get their name for how they move. Now we're getting into something different from tissue. Now we're going to talk specifically about the ways that muscles contract, namely in terms of the, quote, twitch, or how fast the contraction is and how long it lasts. You'll hear this for, quote, different athletes. If a person's basically fast twitch, it's anaerobic in nature. It's what you see for short bursts. So your athletes in sports like baseball, football, where they're not doing things for long, sustained periods of time, but when they do it, the bursts are really, really quick, powerful, dynamic, etc. Alrighty? Those would be fast twitch muscles. The problem is these muscles tend to fatigue a lot more quickly. In other words, if I were to take this entire class, put them on a field, and just do a 50-yard sprint, there are some folks who will demonstrate superiority that they can get really, really, really fast, really, really quickly, and yet have them try to sustain for a long period of time, let's say to go more than 2 miles. They tend to fatigue a lot more quickly. Whereas the people that are basically built with a lot of, quote, slow twitch muscle, now we're talking about your, quote, aerobic muscles. They don't fire out real quick. These are the folks that aren't going to be able to sprint with the others, however they're able to sustain over longer periods of time. I was nicknamed Captain Slow Twitch when I was down in Texas because I was the epitome of the slow twitch concept. I could run a half marathon in some of my younger years in about 6-minute 45-second per mile pace, which is pretty good. The thing is, if you time me for 1 mile, I probably wouldn't run much faster than about 6:20. All right, so there wasn't a big difference with how fast I'd run 1 mile from how fast I'd run 13 miles. I could find a lot of folks who could do 400 meters really, really, really fast, but couldn't even make 5 miles. They'd literally fatigue. And again, that has to do with the twitch of the fibers. People who do activities like soccer, lacrosse, tennis to a lesser degree, basketball for sure. People that are constantly in movement but have those periodic explosive bursts are going to have that healthy balance of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fiber, which makes them better adaptable to other sports or activities. All right, go ahead and stop this and start a new